Hey folks, you may know that I do this all on my own. I collect the content, I do the interviews, I produce it, and I process the audio and I process the video, and I do this all on my own. And I do have to pay for programs for some of this stuff and apps for communicating. And, it costs a little bit of money and it takes a lot of time and a lot of work. And it would be great if you wanted to be a patron at patreon.com/skepticalleftist. I would really appreciate it. And if not, it would be great if you could go to like iTunes or Podchaser or some other pod review site and give me 5 stars or a rating or a review of some kind, something positive, and maybe share the show out with your friends and family, anybody you think would like it. If you think somebody needs a little bit of exposure to like a worker who just happens to also enjoy discussing political philosophy, it would be great if you shared the show around. Everything that you do helps. Hey everyone, I'm once again very happy to bring you another episode of The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. This time around, I have another great interview. I'm talking to Brandie, host of the True North Radio. We talk a lot about politics and prisons in Saskatchewan. I had to cut this down a bit again, but if you want the full interview, then you can find this slightly longer version by becoming a patron. Or you can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com to tell me you want a copy of the audio or a link to the video. Then I also have a short section for the Ask an Anarchist. I added a little bit of post-conversation commentary, but I think that this will be the last of the episodes with Renee, and then I'll move on to questions and comments I received on TikTok and Instagram. Then we have Red Reviews number 9, where we talk about Nixonland by Rick Perlstein. And then you get about 10 minutes of Anarchist Reading Corner, where I read an excerpt from the book The Anarchist Turn. But before I get into that, I need to thank Christopher Taylor for becoming a new patron at the Definitely an Anarchist level. If you want to become a patron, then you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't afford that, then a like, a comment, or a share would help a lot. This whole thing is about getting more eyes watching and more ears listening, and hopefully radicalizing some folks. I was on Damien Marie AtHope's YouTube channel again this past week, so if you like hearing me talk, then make sure to check that out. I will post a link in the show notes or in the description box below. I've had a few things going on lately that I wanted to talk about, and I mean, the world has had a few things going on that I thought I should touch on. First, obviously, is the wild shit happening in Afghanistan, and I don't have much anything important to say about it. I don't know enough, and I think that we should be listening to people who have more knowledge in this area. I kind of just hope that we can convince all our governments to let all the refugees in, because helping people is kind of the whole point of having a society, I think. I'm also gonna just, I typed this script out for my intro, and I could almost comment on the bullshit liberal apologism for how Joe Biden actually is. And yes, I could comment on it, and I actually am going to comment. He hasn't accomplished anything that people to the farther left of the spectrum wanted. I know a lot of people were saying, well, of course he didn't, but there were some of those things that left progressive people asked for that he said he would provide. That not everything that there were some things like student loan forgiveness that he literally just said, no, I'm never fucking doing that without the fucking. He said, I'm never doing that, which makes him trash already. He also isn't doing anything about the minimum wage. He isn't helping people that need help. He isn't doing anything about the border. He's still bombing places. And now he pulled out of Afghanistan, and we know where that's lying. I mean, on the hierarchy of problems about Afghanistan, I think Joe Biden is maybe pretty down the list on who to blame, but he's not blameless either. So, the thing that really pisses me off, though, is he hasn't done any of this stuff, like even one thing. And we're all supposed to forgive the fact that he doesn't want to do it, or that he just sucks, because it's only been 6 months. And it's just always funny to me how the Republicans don't give a fuck and they do whatever they want in the first week. And then it takes months to undo it. Like the ban on, the Muslim ban was in and out of courts for months. And there was times when people could travel and there was times when they couldn't. But when it comes to the Democrats, they don't just do shit and then expect backlash. They defeat themselves before they even try. They go, oh, well, that's actually against the rules. Oh, well, I can't do that because we'll never get the votes. Fucking try something. Like, you fucking suck so bad. Just try something. Oh my God. But they never will. And that's when you complain about it, that's when you get the apologism. And when you complain about it, that's when you get the apologism, or the people who act like you're being unreasonable or out of control with what your expectations are. They always so I really, really hate the Republicans. But at this point, like, if they don't try to do things, then the Democrats deserve to lose in 2 years. Or now it's like a year and a half. Like, they deserve to lose if they aren't going to even try to get more progressive legislation going. And seriously, fuck all the people who claimed they would pull Biden to the left or hold him accountable because we don't worship our leaders like Trump supporters do. Fuck that. I wish that they could at least be honest with themselves and say that, yes, they're team people. They worship their team. They stay on with their team and they'll defend their team, even if it goes against any factual basis or any good for anybody. But, okay, so enough complaining about liberals in the United States, because, hey, in Canada, we're having an election. And that means that we have our own liberals to complain about. So, Justin Trudeau sucks ass. He sucks all of the ass. And then he will breathe in your face and tell you that his shitty breath is great and that you have to vote for him or else Aaron the dipshit O'Toole is going to win, and that's the end of Canada or whatever, right? And Aaron O'Toole sucks, but so does Justin Trudeau. I can't speak for anyone but myself, really, I guess, but I've had enough of his placating for oil companies and his lack of action on helping Indigenous communities. And liberals are on social media already telling us that a vote for the NDP or a vote for the Green Party is a vote for the Conservatives. No, the fuck it isn't. Like, if you could actually pull your head out of the team sports that democracy has turned into, then you might actually consider voting for someone or something based on ideology or based on evidence instead of just team sports. And in case people who listen or watch this don't already know, I do prefer to vote for ideas and not for people. I hate party politics, and I think way too many people are invested in believing that things can improve without actually changing the dynamics of the system. Electoral reform was supposed to at least try to do that, but Trudeau, once he got in power, backed off of that promise because it wasn't beneficial to him. And yes, I'm still pissed off about that too. There are a lot of different options for how we could run our system, but the one that we have serves the party who holds power, and that's why it's not going to change. So, speaking of change, I'm interested in getting involved in a tenants union, and I'd love to get involved with someone who is working on a general strike in Canada or Saskatchewan. So if any listeners know of any direction I could start looking for that, I would really appreciate it. I've done a bit of digging myself, but when you Google things like tenants union Saskatchewan, all you get is the labor the rentalsman standards. And when you Google general strike in Canada, you get results from the Winnipeg General Strike. And while that's very cool and it's very interesting to read about history, it does not help me. So hopefully that wasn't too long. That's all I'm hoping to rant about today. I'm a little pissed at a few different people. I'm pissed at the liberals. I'm pissed at conservatives. I'm pissed at the atheist community for not being as progressive as they should be. I'm pissed that skeptics think politics isn't the right thing for them to talk about. And I'm pissed at communists who think that anarchists don't have anything valuable to say. As you'll find out in this week's episode of Anarchist Reading Corner, both anarchism and Marxism benefit from each other and can solve some of the problems in the other philosophy. So Anyway, thanks for joining me this fortnight, this 2-week period, and I will see you on the other side of the interview. So, hi and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I cover progressive politics, left-wing philosophy, and critical thinking. Today I'm joined by Brandie from True North Radio, and we're practically neighbors.
Yeah, definitely.
So thanks for joining me.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. I am really happy to see new left indie grassroots media taking hold. So thank you.
We can get some more of it.
Yeah.
So I guess first off, to get people to know you a little bit, what's your background? What got you into whatever you're doing now, True North Radio, and I guess your political ideology.
Sure. Yeah. This is loaded.
Loaded. That's right.
I've lived in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, like my whole life. I grew up here. My family is here, and I mean, people from high school who know me, they'll know that like I've always been this way.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. It's hypocrisy and injustice is something that you grow up with when you live in North Battleford. So it's very glaring. And I think at this point, I feel like, certainly the Sanders campaign relit my fire if it was indeed dimming.
Right.
And at the same time, I met with some really cool people from the North Battleford, the Battleford's Saskatchewan NDP.
Okay.
And at the through them, and I think their actions, their deeds, is that a lot of the constituency rally around Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls for action.
Right.
So I was really attracted to them. Like, I saw they do good work. They've done a lot of help with like naming unmarked graves and stuff. And they've been doing that for a long time.
Right. Not just new stuff, eh?
Like... Yeah, not just jumping on a bandwagon, hey, putting an orange sticker and but actually, like, not performative politics, right?
Right.
And so I was very impressed with the constituency and with the actions and the deeds that they do in Saskatchewan. Okay. So I was like, became a card-carrying member of the NDP. And it was the first time I've been a card-carrying member of anything. But what I think I saw was that they actually follow up with real... Yeah. Right? Because
that makes a big difference.
It does. I'm like, no, they're actually doing stuff. What? Yeah. And I think that's what happens in a rural place. Like, when I talk to people about politics, they always naysay me, hey, like, they're all the same. It's all divisive and it's all this. The fact is that, like, me and you are talking right here on this Saskatchewan podcast.
Yeah.
Regional, local, cities, smaller places. Like, there are people everywhere who want help and they want to get her done. And that's the point, is that you have to have some kind of infrastructure to do so. Yeah. And some kind of link and some kind of coalition and some kind of group of people where you can get a lot of voices going.
Yeah. It's really hard to do something if it's just yourself doing it, right? Yeah. You have to, I mean, in Regina, I've been looking for more groups around too, right? Like, I'm always trying to find a group. Okay, well, what can we do together? What kind of activities, what kind of organizing can we do to, let's improve this situation locally? I mean, that's all I can personally do right now.
Exactly. And I mean, community building and like solidarity and like coming together, this takes actually like, meeting people. And I know that's hard. And like being somewhere and like together. And I think the thing about like politics is it's so divisive and so crazy. Like everything.
Well, yeah, especially the bigger you get, right? Like the more it's so divided nationally, and then we have a smaller kind of microcosm of that on the provincial scale. But then when you start getting into like municipal politics or like local politics, then you can start, maybe you can make a difference. I get to know my city councilor, or I can potentially.
Yeah. Right.
John Findura is like, I don't know, he appears to be a pretty conservative person, so I'm not sure, but
yeah, no, totally.
But that's like, it's so divided nationally, but maybe we can actually do something more close to home.
And it's, and I love that, because it's like, it doesn't have to be a grand scale to make big change and to make waves and to make connections that live on. And that's the thing about regional and local stuff, is that, you know, it's like the concept of mutual aid, in a sense, where it's like, you're directly helping.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they see you. People see you. They say, oh, there's her with, you know, she's hanging around with NDP people again, but they're directly helping. Right. They're directly offering something tangible. And like, so I've always been this way, but I think that in 2016, when Sanders opened his mouth, I was like, I'm a burner too. Because neoliberalism is a scourge.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. And it's done this to our society.
Yeah.
You know, by constantly emptying the coffers. And I'm just seeing a revivification at the local and the grassroots level, and people becoming more and more interested. And that's how you grow a movement. You know, nothing's going to happen overnight. And I think people sort of want that. Like, like something's going to happen, you know? Yeah, but it's like the job of putting your name to the legislation is very boring, and it takes a really long time. Yeah, and you have to go through a lot of annoyance and frustration to like do it. But then if you do get it done, you're impacting lives like in Saskatchewan, or, you know, and people, you know. So genuinely improving
your neighbor's life.
Yeah. And that would improve your life. Yeah. But you're kind of seeing a resurgence of that community solidarity feeling. And I think I felt it with the Sanders campaign, when a lot of our some Canadian MPs and some of our like candidates that we had in Saskatchewan ended up going and getting to organize with Bernard, you know, with the campaign on the ground in Seattle, or with the campaign on the ground, and get that valuable, not only being with like comrades, some of these people are fighting for their life.
Right.
And so it kind of makes you want to do it more. I think, you know, and that people are, like, you kind of want that solidarity. It's good. So,
yeah, for sure. So what got True North Radio started?
True North Radio, 2016-ish. It was like late 2016 when Joe Hargrave cut STC.
Oh, okay.
So we have an STC right here in the Battlefords. We had a place, you know, if you wanted to go on the bus to Saskatoon, you went down to the STC in the Battlefords, and that's where you went. And you got a safe, like, affordable, reliable, on time, you know, with a bathroom trip to Saskatoon to see your cousins for the weekend, you know. Yep. And that was like such a blow to the community here, because there's so many elderly people and like seniors of fixed income who used STC to get to cancer treatment and stuff.
Yeah.
So it really screwed up healthcare. Our like shipments of prescriptions like methadone or special things, when, you know, emergency EMT type pharmaceuticals used to get here via, we knew they would be here. And so it was just a heavy blow, and there was nobody talking about it.
Right.
They were kind of taking Joe Hargrave bum a ride. Like, that's not acceptable. Yeah. So I got mad. So
that's understandable.
Yeah. So we had a group of activists, and the most wonderful and radical activists you'll ever find are like women over 65. You are not going to want to F with these women. And they were so great. And we kind of had a campaign, and we got the, you know, Saskatchewan NDP involved. Nicole Rancourt was our buddy MLA, and she came down and she participated. Like, it was it was a really nice showing of solidarity between us and PA. And I did a bunch of videos. Well, my husband and I, he's an artist. He's trained as an artist, mixed media, like video, audio. He's a producer, music production and maybe some film and stuff. And I said, dude, we have to do something that's going to like galvanize how ridiculous Joe Hargrave is in this moment in time.
Right.
So we started True North Radio. And we made a few, you know, different little commercials and a few different things that like tried to bring as much attention as we could to it.
Yeah, that's cool.
And I think we won some hearts because I know a lot of people were very disgusted that Joe Hargrave wasn't being challenged more on telling people to bum a ride when we have so many missing people in the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Part of that too is that there's no transportation.
Right. Yeah. You take away like you say, you take away a safe way for them to travel. And then, you know, I mean, there was enough of a problem before that. So what are you going to see when you take away the safe means of transportation?
Exactly. And, you know, I went to Herb Cox's office. I dressed up like an angel. I said I was the angel of STC and I was there to put on a show. And all of these women who are so radical and they're older and stuff. And I said, just let me direct you. I'm going to do a Christmas story play, but it's going to be about Brad Wall and losing STC. And they said, okay, Brandie. So I was like, okay. And they let me, and my husband videotaped it and stuff. And he did the production, the post-production on it. And awesome. It was awesome. And after that, I, as an angel, marched in with my squad, and they really were, into the office of local women over 65. Like, it wasn't scary. Like, I think sometimes people think activists are so scary, and it's like, these are like grandmas.
Right. They're not just a bunch of angry 20-somethings with bats and wearing all black, right? No,
like under no circumstances. And that's one of the biggest propaganda media thing. It's like these activists are like, you know, does everybody have do you have your walker? Can we get you? You know, like we're right. Yeah. You know, we're trying to love each other and prove it by doing something.
Yeah.
And we talked to Herb Cox, and I went in there and I said, and I showed him all of the literature, like Highway 16 isn't something new. The Highway of Tears is something that's been talked about for a long time and reported on, right? Going in there and saying like, this is a situation whereby we losing transportation where we could be looking at something really, really ugly, dude. You know, and he looked so offended and so like out of his element, like he had no idea what I was talking about. And that was part of my kind of getting emboldened too. It's like, why do we have representatives and leaders who don't understand the issues?
Right.
Like in any way other than neoliberal sign a check. Right. Yeah.
Well, that's just it. All they think is that this is a cost. Like the thing about the STC was, which, for non-Saskatchewan listeners, it's a Saskatchewan Transportation Corporation. But it provided a service of a bus system throughout Saskatchewan. And they stopped, it was always framed like, well, this is a company that's losing money. Right. But this is not a company designed to make money. This is a service you're providing the citizens of your province. Like, what are you talking about? You don't need to make money. You should be just trying to get it the best service you can get for your people.
Exactly. And that was the lie that I don't think we could crack through at that time.
Right. Yeah.
Like that was the major lie. And that's a neoliberal austerity lie.
Yep. Exactly.
And for someone like me who I study history, I love at the University of Saskatchewan. I absolutely adore history, and I love it, like ancient history and military history. Nice. And it's like, oh, you're the only lady in here, you know, kind of thing. I'm like, I know, bring it on. I want to hear about it. So and I loved it so much. And from like that experience of education, which I never finished because we were so indebted and had kids and had to like, I was like, hey, but it's not. I'm a regular Saskatchewan person though.
Right.
Right.
I wanted to ask you too about some of your more recent stuff, discussing like prisons or inmates for humanity or stuff like that. Like, how did you get involved with prison abolition stuff and inmates?
Right. No, that's a good question. Yeah, well, True North Radio was like this brainchild that I kind of came up with my constituency too. Like they were like, thumbs up, Brandie, we love this so much. But you know, there was a cooling off period because it seemed to me right before COVID hit, I felt like is all lost. You know, like I had such a deep depression because it was like people were voting in the Sask party, even though they've shit on us for like ever. There was a general feeling of like, oh, you know, they won. Well, nobody won anything. And it was depressing for like, I think like our constituency, and I know other like EDAs and discussion, you know, people around Saskatchewan, that this was very like harsh. And then when COVID hit, it's like, oh, okay, you know, like we got clowns running the show in Saskatchewan. We got a circus now of clowns. And it's really showing them for what they are. They can't function. They can only function under the playbook of the neoliberal agenda. They can't function outside of that. And I think their true colors are being seen now because of so many people in healthcare, education, people who have kids in school. It's more than just STC now because STC really was a way the poor travel.
Right.
So nobody wants to be associated with the poor traveling. But healthcare, education, these things are major, major players. So I rebooted True North Radio because I felt the time was ripe to do so. And I also... I don't know if you're familiar with Slavoj Žižek. Yep. Slavoj, my favorite philosopher, he put out a book called Pandemic in like 2 seconds. Like he literally wrote it in like a week of probably cocaine frenzy. and they released it in true Marxist style. And I got a PDF and I was reading this during COVID. Kids are home. It was a weird dream-like time for me. Like I felt very isolated. I felt very like not knowing. So when Slavoj this book hit the presses too, it was almost like we have the ability to really galvanize global issues in this moment because you're going to be seeing these governments who have no idea what to do other than follow the playbook. Yeah. They're not relevant anymore. So yeah.
And they were, I mean, Saskatchewan government in particular was incredibly reliant on oil. So then as soon as when the pandemic hit and they're out of their depth already. And then the oil price drops into negative territory. And they have absolutely no ability to understand how to function in this scenario, right?
No. Like, if it was a joke to me before, like, now, I mean, it's absurd. And I think, well, like, reading Pandemic, reading Slavoj, and saying, like, to me, when my mind, maybe I'm a weirdo, but my mind first goes to the permanent underclass first. Whenever there's shit hitting the fan with the rest of us, the shit already hit the fan. Oh, yeah. The permanent underclass. Like, they're, like, not... So I took a risk and I jumped in with both feet and I emailed Beyond Prison Walls Canada, which is run by an advocate by the name of Sherry Meyer. Okay. She is a justice graduate. And she's, she's furthering herself along in law. And I think one day she hopes to be a lawyer. She could be my lawyer. She's awesome. But you kind of jumped in with both feet and I sent her this letter. I didn't know what to expect back, but I said, this is me. My name's Brandie. True North Radio is my show. I'm here to amplify issues. And if anybody wants to speak to me, hey, I'm happy to do it. Nice. And and then I later on, she's, here she's got a lot of mutual friends in justice who I know. And so it ends up being like that 6 degrees of separation, like Saskatchewan, here we are. And we're sort of getting more connected with each other and we're sort of seeing, what we can do. So that's what I did. So I ended up getting a call from the late Corey Cardinal now. But Corey was a decades long activist, like poet, warrior, protector in Saskatchewan and across the nation. Like someone who just, and, you know, so for me, almost to have that weird interaction where I got to like get interviews and get phone calls with how are people organizing on the inside?
Right.
Like, what are people on the inside doing? How are they going to, what kind of solidarity do they need from us on the outside? Like how, you know, and all of that. And so that rebooting True North Radio is probably the best thing I did.
Right.
Because we were able during COVID-19 to get in and get people more aware of this, like the austerity agenda in the jails is like, this is hell. It's a hellscape, Corey. It's so like, yeah. So like to get in, to show, to have that. So that's what, like, you know, and through that movement and through Corey, I met a lot of abolitionists.
Nice.
I met a lot of, and it's like I felt at home with them. Because you can't, how are you going to say, like 90% of people incarcerated and on remand, we have a really buggered up remand legislation here. It's very bizarre. It's meant to keep heads in the jails and show worth so that the neoliberal government can cash in on that.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is where I am now.
I remember there was when Brad Wall was still in charge, there was a protest. There was I think even a hunger strike because the food in the jails in Saskatchewan it was just atrocious. And I mean, because we're in Saskatchewan, it's very Sask party, very conservative. You got a lot of push and pull. And Brad Wall said something of like, what was it? Oh, well, then they shouldn't have gone into jail in the first place.
Right.
Just completely ignoring the context that leads to all this stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. And being like racist.
Yeah.
Being like openly racist.
Yeah.
And having people be fine with that.
Right. Yeah. Even encouraging it and thinking he said the right things.
Well, speaking of it was 2018 that the prison riot over food happened. And that was because there's a company, and of course it's a foreign interest company. Right. It's not like we're not making money off of this locally.
No, it's an American corporation, right? Some
kind of corp. Actually, I think it's good old Britain.
Oh, okay.
I believe it might be British. They love their British. They're royalists. Yeah, so they got, and I think they're UK, certainly situated, Compass Foods. And that was quietly approved again.
Right.
This last year. And the food is, like, for him to make that joke and for us to know after what happened with Kamloops, the people who are 90% incarcerated in shitty jails that are old as hell and sick and overcrowded and disgusting. I don't think people understand how disgusting it is. Like, you can't clean it anymore. Like, it's not possible.
Right. Yeah.
And they always, so their whole thing too, remand center. But I'll get back to that. But this food and stuff is like, when you see this Kamloops thing, and part of that, we did a solidarity fast with on Canada Day for the Every Child Matters movement and stuff. A lot of the people in there are people who have been in the care, I'm putting quotes, air quotes, if you can't see me, the care of the state since they were like 4. People who are very low skilled, people who have not been assessed for disability, people who haven't been helped. And these, as they're mourning these children's graves on the inside, these are the children of survivors.
Right.
And a lot of them are survivors themselves. And I just really hope Saskatchewan can see that paradox, that juxtaposed political, I don't know what to call it, but criminals.
Yeah. Quote unquote criminals. Like, members of an over-policed community who have been made to be criminals by the injustice system that we have.
Exactly. Yeah. So, so Sherry has no intention of backing down. Like, she's got a lot of like people on the inside, I think, slowly they know they're incarcerated for now, but slowly you must chip away at it.
Right.
Was a quote I heard from like a Métis writer talking about it.
Okay.
Who might like write for Briar Patch. Just another like, yes, isn't that a Saskatchewan thing to a degree?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So
yeah, I'm pretty sure Briar Patch is Saskatchewan.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I have trouble keeping up with all the Saskatchewan stuff.
Well, and there has been I mean, speaking of Saskatchewan media, there has been an increase over the last few years of Saskatchewan-focused progressive media. So it's nice to see.
It is. And like Corey spearheaded, I guess, the Inmates for Humane Conditions.
Right.
And that is meant to act as a form of mutual aid and a form of a way, like, when you're talking about Compass Foods, let's go also to that there is in the middle of Saskatoon, there's a concession, right? So if you got the money, you could buy extra stuff.
Right.
The prices are like 3 or 4 or 5, up to 7 times higher than Walmart.
Yeah.
It's strictly owned by and I guess it's I don't know all the details, so I won't go into the details, but it's something that I've been researching for a while. And that was part of the riot too, where like they're getting ripped off. Their families are getting ripped off.
Yeah.
The Telmate system rips them off. So essentially you're just looking at like people being bled who have nothing to bleed. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you say, and then they're stuck in a position where even when they come out, like then they're already behind the 8 ball in terms of how they're going to build their life within this very biased system, this very one-sided system.
Oh, totally. And I have some interviews on True North Radio. If you got the link, you can check them out. With people who are recently released, they were released into destitution.
Right.
They're released with no resources. Released where, like, if they were on medication or they had a psychiatric diagnosis on the inside and they were receiving medication as monitored by the inside, once they got out, remanded, tried to get placed, their medication gets all, messed up for several weeks. That's not healthy. That's not okay. That's total abuse. Right. Yeah. So there's there's so many layers to the abuse that happens. Like, so.
Yeah. It's pretty. My brother, he was in Regina. So I have a little bit of experience with that. Like, we had to take him money regularly because he still smoked. So he had to be able to buy cigarettes and couldn't buy snacks or whatever unless he had money. It's not a good place for people to be. And it's not rehabilitating people the way that, that's not a thing that's happening.
Love those Twitter posts by the Canadian Correctional Services that are like, have a Canada flag and like a buffalo and stuff. And they're like, we're really working hard here to make amends, Oh, yeah. And it's like, it's so blatant too. Because it's like, there's no resources. There is no resources. There is no rehabilitation. Like Corey, he gets out. They knew he was an addict. Right. They knew that there were certain things that could have prevented his death, and nothing was done.
Of course. Because to the system, he doesn't matter, right? Like nobody matters to the system. No. I don't really have the words to say.
So fun, isn't it? It's so depressing. Like,
yeah. It's nice to talk to you, though.
No, it's great. No, I do. Well, I'm kind of excited because what excites me and these are heavy issues. And to me, sometimes if you don't approach heavy stuff with it, like one thing, like on True North Radio, if like Corey Cardinal phoned in, or if you were talking, we had a rap night. We had an Aboriginal storytelling night.
Nice.
But we were featuring rappers, and the rappers came on, and these rappers it was so good. Nice. And if you want to know the breakdown of Canada and how people are feeling, you can listen to the rappers, especially on the inside. Yeah. So, that was something where I kind of, my whole point of doing True North Radio was like, can we have a narrative that celebrates people sometimes?
For sure.
You know, can we have a narrative where like, these are regular people who live in our community? Like we were saying at the beginning, you know, like these are people that we grew up with, that we went to high school with, like,
yeah.
Or, you know,
they don't stop being people because, you know,
and that's how the guys totally frame it when they were like phoning, is that we feel like we stopped being human.
Right.
As soon as we came in here, like we weren't Canadian citizens. We weren't anything. So
just stuffed into a cell.
Warehouse so the Sask Party can count ahead so they can get their money from Trudeau.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because despite the name liberal, they feed the system the same way the conservatives do, right? Like it's all the same parties feeding the same system.
Right. It's like the same interests are invested on both sides. They don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that I want to pretend like we said at the start, like we don't want to say, that all politicians are identical, right?
Right,
because
right.
if there's somebody doing something work on the ground, then that's a slightly different situation. But Justin Trudeau and Scott Moe, their interests aren't that different, actually.
No. They align really well behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Backdoor deals, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that too.
Well, I guess we might as well do the counter-propaganda. And what you have here is the media narrative during the initial wave of COVID-19 as it relates to prisoners, charter rights, and human rights.
Right.
The media missed a mark in a big way.
Huge way.
Yeah, it made me think, like you also said, not seeing much independent thought. And I have a friend, we do book reviews for part of the show.
Yeah.
And one of his things is like, okay, so I don't want to necessarily insult journalists, but journalists in general are not a very intellectually curious bunch. They take what's given to them as a press release and they just write it as a story. There's not a lot of like quote unquote journalism going on there.
Yeah.
But
exactly. Well, like my favorite journalist in the whole world is Julian Assange. Like journalism, it's about giving the facts, but at the same time, it's about framing it too. Like, and when you live in a place like Saskatchewan, like we know that there's going to be a heavy black boot framing.
Yeah.
The narrative. Right. And I mean, if you say anything out of the ordinary, you're already, you're a full on commie.
But not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not. I mean, Trotsky, I love you still to this day. But yeah, like independent thought, critical thinking, right? Yeah. I have a brain. I can use it. And like cancel culture has a lot to do with this too, where it's like, oh, we're not listening to them anymore. We're not reading that anymore. We're not doing this anymore. Use your brain. God, you're given a brain. Like you can use it.
You can use it.
Yeah. And I think the framing in Saskatchewan with the Saskatchewan media, I mean, I'm just feeling a real corporate vibes off of it.
Well, I mean, it is all owned by big companies, right? All like Global and CTV and even CBC is our national news, but I mean, they run themselves just like any other news organization that is a giant company.
And it was disgusting, like to call it a trick, to hear Corey Cardinal speak about the dehumanization, to hear him talk about decolonization, to hear him talk about things that need to happen, and to have the media call it a tray refusal. Right. Was really disgusting. Like, and it goes with that cattle mentality that they kind of have. Right. Where once you're kind of behind bars, you're kind of, you can make fun, poke fun. You can make silly jokes about stuff. You can, and I find it just really unacceptable. So. Yeah, for sure. It's very much, like you say, even as a society, like we automatically dismiss people who have been incarcerated. And then the media, as a result, can, like you say, make little jokes or dismiss what their protests. Like they can call a hunger strike, like a serious protest inside, a tray refusal, like that. Like
You can just do that because society doesn't actually care about people who are incarcerated.
And to me, that's an abuse of power. And and journalists, like, to be a journalist, to read and write at that level, I know you have some education.
Yeah.
You know, I know you didn't miss all the liberal, the humanities classes that you were forced to take. So to me, if you have everybody, I guess, who has a platform big enough has to accept that there's some power that goes with that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And if you're going to call yourself a journalist, like, maybe you should be committed to the truth a little bit.
No, there you go. I love that line. I like that line. I'm going to steal that line, comrade.
No worries. Yeah.
There was a time when the truth mattered. And that kind of takes me to, like, my political ideology overall is, like, y'all, do you play Assassin's Creed?
I do not, but I have in the past.
But in the past too, for me, long before children in diapers and formula, but nothing is true. Everything is permitted. Is an ancient sort of creed used by military cultures,
right?
Military castes and, like, military ideologies throughout history. And it's sort of like, at this point in history, you're sort of looking with hearts that can connect, like. You're looking for, like, who is the enemy? I don't know. They're making it seem like everyone.
Right.
But maybe everyone is conspiring for you, too. So it's, like, a matter of, like, kind of, like, just shifting our perspective. And I see with, like, our local, like, being on the show, and having, like, True North Radio and stuff, that we're sort of reclaiming that for ourselves, where we're going to make our own reality here on the ground because we see a different reality.
Well, we experience a different reality, right, than what's portrayed in the media.
Exactly.
So, it's it's like there's a line in anarchist circles where everything is a psyop, and it seems really conspiratorial. Like, you're like, oh, come on, there's some real things going on, but
of course,
but it really is. Like, once you start learning about media a little bit, like, everything kind of is a psyop. Everything is framed in a certain way, editorialized in a certain way. And
exactly. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I know. I feel like that the political wave in Saskatchewan is going to watch out for us. I'm not a millennial. I am considered whatever was before that. I think it's called Gen X. That's me.
That's me too.
And I'm like, Gen X for the win on this. Like, we were raised by the time the 90s came. Like, I was a teenager in North Battleford. I was I felt like I was already dead. Like, I was like, what? Like, what do we have to look forward to?
Well, we were raised in what they called the end of history.
Right.
They literally called it the end of history.
They literally did. Yeah. Thanks for that.
What were we supposed to think?
We took it literally. So we're like, we're making our own now.
Yeah, that's right.
But I feel like youth always gets written off. And I feel like the teenager, like when I was a teenager and in my early 20s and trying to make it, and in my early 30s trying to make it still, seeing people going home and living with mom and dad in North Battleford is like normal. Everybody does. Some people stay forever.
Right.
There's no work unless, like, there's work, but it's contract, perilous work, like, contract shitty work, especially if you have kids. So I just see like really a stagnant economy as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think Gen X for the win on this, please, Gen X, speak up.
So foes and comrades. Let's go there.
Okay.
So you've got Rosemary Falk, MP for Battleford's Lloyd constituency.
Right.
Not a friend to the people.
Not a friend. Certainly a false friend. Maybe she's trying to put on the sheep, trying to put on the sheep's clothing, but there's a wolf under there. She sent me a letter because I harassed her. She's our Battleford's Lloyd Minister Member of Parliament. Right. And I have been emailing her since the Andrew Scheer years.
Oh, yeah.
Because North 99, they're like a kind of a grassroots sort of organization that are political on the ground in Ontario, I believe. So I've been keeping my eye on her, emailing her. I've sent many, many emails. I've had very few responses.
Okay.
I sent the last email I sent was regarding Kamloops because there was an important NDP vote coming up, whether she was going to stand in solidarity with some of these actions. And I got a lovely letter back from her, but the fact is like, how can I trust you?
Well, yeah,
you know, right. Like O'Toole is like lives up to his name. No, Rosemary's. Like, I mean, it's nice that they're committed. They're committed to Truth and Reconciliation Commission 70, actions 70 through 76 or 78, I believe. Okay. But that is what we're in the process of doing. Right. Which is uncovering the horror so that the people can heal. That was an action that was called for a long time ago. And I'm sorry, that's not good enough because everybody in a position of power in federal should be following those actions. Yeah. So I just feel like, how can I trust you? Yeah. Yeah. It's
70 to 76 out of 94. That's not very
No. And that again, trying to like make it like nice little letter you sent there, Rosemary. Right. Right. Yeah. But it's not going to cut the mustard. So yeah. But so she's a foe, definitely. Okay.
And to compare, we have Comrades. You've got Nicole Sowers and Mira Conway.
I do. So the friends of the people here.
That's good.
But Nicole is like amazing. And she has done exactly what we were talking about earlier, is that she made grassroots legislation come to fruition so that people who are experiencing domestic violence in their apartments didn't have to pay $2,500 to some corporate entity before they could leave. Right. And they shouldn't have to stay there. And she, she followed through on that, and she had, she was talking, and that made a huge difference for people living in Saskatoon. Right. And to me, she was a friend, like a real friend. For sure. And, Mira Conway, she came to our city. She got in the last election. Regina Ethelstone Center. Don't know exactly. She's
Elphinstone is kind of it's kind of downtown-ish.
Okay.
Ish.
Yeah. And she was a lawyer. She was a legal aid lawyer. Right. But she came down. The Lighthouse in North Battleford is our emergency shelter. We only have one. It's patronized by about 22 to 25 of the same people. Okay. And this is North Battleford. This is a small place. Right. Like they cut that funding. Down to nothing. Yeah. And they did that earlier. They did that in like 2016, 2017 budgets too. But like I said with STC, like we're not going to get involved with being aligned with the poor, of course, the inmates or anybody like that. But she came down and she spoke at our rally, and it was huge, like for the center of North Battleford. I know it sounds, but this is what I'm talking about, regional and local. Is that we had like 45 plus people. We had tons of signs. You had people dropping off donuts and food just because they believed in the cause. Right. You had people showing up. One thing I like to do is when I go to a rally or something like that, I like to see who doesn't show up. Right. Because I'm like, this is being framed as like people don't want to be near things where poverty is involved. But the fact of the matter is, this is a city. People live here. This is a shelter. It offers this. This is healthcare, right? We get resources for people who can't access them. But people frame it like it's something totally out of the ordinary. Right. I thought that's how civilization ran. It's like,
right. There are people who need things, and this is where they get those things.
Yes, and when she came down, she really spoke to the power dynamic. She really spoke to the issues to things that I felt like needed to be said. And there was a big group of people there, and the media were there, and everybody was there, and it drew attention to our city. And I felt like she was a friend to the people.
That's awesome.
Yes.
No, that's good.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, we're approaching the end of our time.
We are.
Where can people find you and your content?
Well, on YouTube, True North Radio on YouTube. At Home Fire Sask on Twitter. And I have a personal Facebook, but I just use it so I can Facebook is one of those things now. Maybe this is a Gen X thing. But Facebook is one of those things where I'm just like, oh, I want to die. I have to scroll through this place, like Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, I'm on there, but I think I'd keep it to, Twitter and the Twitterverse and also to the YouTubers.
Yeah. I'm an old guy, so Facebook is my home domain.
Okay, yeah. This is separate.
Yeah. Although I'm getting into Instagram. I'm having a lot more on Instagram. I like
Instagram is fun, and I abandoned it for quite some time. And I'm seeing, though, that the TikTokers, now these are people who are way younger than me, but for the most part. But I'm seeing that as a really cool way to get 2 minutes of vital information out.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I love TikTok, actually. Even if you're because I get a lot of social justice stuff on my TikTok.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fun.
But even the stuff that isn't social justice, it's just fun stuff that makes me smile or I can laugh, So yeah, TikTok is great. I don't know why so many people don't like it.
You know what? I think you've sold me. I might end up. It'll be if I can possibly get my handle.
Right.
Yeah. So. No, it's a cool interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me. All right, that's it for the interview. If you want to check out Brandie's content or True North Radio, you can do that. The links will be in the show notes or the description box. And if you enjoyed it, please check out my other interviews. And next segment is Ask an Anarchist.
Well, I was reading where they were trying to bring up the ideal or showing hunter-gatherer societies or ideally anarchistic. And, the division of labor was equal and, the division between the sexes and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, well, that's probably true, but we're kind of several thousand years away from the hunter-gatherer society. So I don't know if that's a good comparison.
Yeah,
I think I'm sure there still exists hunter-gatherer societies in the world, but they're very small.
Yeah, and often in untouched regions where the rule is, hey, we don't go there because we can carry disease in there that they aren't exposed to now.
They actually learned something from going to the New World.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know how much that's helping with understanding anarchism. I wonder if there's another question or example you have that we might try and go through.
Well, like I said, that's the problem is I
guess I kind of want to touch on this a little bit. It's not necessarily that hunter-gatherer societies were, inherently anarchistic or that's a relevant point to bring up. But I think that it is used because we can say that indigenous tribes often had anarchistic types of mentalities and structures to their communities, and it worked just fine. And I think that's the point, is that it works. You can have that and it's a functioning society. The way that we often get stuck thinking of how things work is we get stuck thinking of them as working within the framework of society that we have now. And that's not necessarily the best way to frame it. Indigenous tribes, again, maybe didn't have cars and didn't have roads the same way that we have roads or a lot of these other things. But it is relevant because when you say, I don't think that an anarchist society could work, it's important to recognize that it has in fact worked. It's just that we've already established this other way of doing things that has kind of broken humans and created this kind of fake scarcity and kind of an illusion of competition when there doesn't have to be one.
So I was trying to understand it, but I was trying to find a simple definition, and everything got lost in the various titles and any of those kind of things. They got into the whole. It was a big argument of a bunch of eggheads getting together and arguing over what is or isn't anarchy. And I was kind of looking for just a simple answer, but I guess there is.
Yeah, no, not really. That's one thing that early on in my my examination of anarchist philosophy was like, I don't think Mike Swistek calls himself a anarchist, but when we were discussing it, I wanted these clear lines, and he said straight up, like, there is no easy out in political philosophy. You have to, it's a ever evolving situation, and you always have to be adapting the new things, new information into what philosophy you want to create, which I think is kind of the way all philosophy is, actually.
Well, that's probably why you get a bunch of, I call it some of the stuff like to me, anarchy and communism and some of those, when you get into the philosophical side of it, I call it pub philosophy. And you get a bunch of guys together, they have a few pints, and then they argue over it. I don't know how realistic the answers are, but that seems to be what
some of the things that
because
I think you can take from anarchists in the modern age that are making an impact in the world right now is you have, well, largely anti-fascist action is mostly anarchists, not only, but by large. So that's often fighting against fascist movements that are around the world, and having an impact in that way. I just want to make a clear statement. I don't know that anti-fascists are majority anarchists. I actually know quite a few Marxists who are also anti-fascists and communists who are anti-fascists. Like, anti-fascism it even has liberals in it, whether or not they'll ride it out for the long haul. But yeah, it's not exclusively anarchists. It's just anarchists are the ones that often get labeled as Antifa and blamed for any trouble that gets that comes up. But I don't want to like paint that other groups aren't anti-fascists. But
for whatever reason,
right? I mean, a lot of anarchists are doing anti-racist stuff. A lot of anarchists are doing mutual aid, where they go out and they'll like provide food and create like breakfast situations where they'll feed everybody in a particular area. Yeah, they'll go to homeless encampments and help them do what they need to do to survive. Stuff like that. Like a lot of these cases are, I mean, they're not all just anarchists, but a lot of, because of the philosophical separation from the state, anarchists tend to take these roles on their own and think that we can provide better for the people than the state is going to. So we don't apply for, say, a grant to, feed people. We go out and we find ways to get food in other ways, and we take it directly to the people.
DIY philosophy, or I was going to say, shit, now the word slipped. It's DIY philanthropy. There we go.
Yeah.
Stumbled over it.
By and large. Yeah. Which, I mean, and have you heard the word praxis?
Yes, I have. In both, so, like, I can't remember the actual word, but it was all, but anyway.
So, yeah.
Star Trek joke there somewhere.
Right. So, praxis is the act of taking action to further both your philosophy and create it in society. And there's lots of, various organizations that do that. So, that's the kind of thing, like, there's artists who go out and they promote anarchism by doing graffiti, or writers who give their writing away for free to people so they can learn about anarchy. There's, like I say, people who do food. Like, there's actually Food Not Bombs is an anarchist organization that promotes giving people food instead of bombing them. Stuff like that. So,
right. Well, no, that makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm a capitalist, but some of the wars that have been fought in the last world doesn't make any sense. We're going to spend trillions of dollars bombing into the Stone Age. I don't see where the cost benefit here doesn't, unless you're the one selling the bombs. But
that's right.
That's a separate. That'd be a separate. That's a separate thing.
Well, it depends, because most of the left views things in a dialectical way or a systemic way. So then you can say, like, why is the U.S. bombing Syria. Well, somebody is benefiting from that, right? Like, so you got to figure out, you got to look at the various, pressures where people are benefiting and where they're losing, and see, well, why, like, because there is a reason, right? And it's not actually to win a war, because it seems like nobody's winning a war, right? You're just hurting a bunch of people and destroying a bunch of property, but somebody's making money. So an anarchist or even a socialist or communist would probably say, like, the reason that we're doing all this bombing is because it serves U.S. empire, and serving U.S. empire serves capital, which is, the people who sell the bombs.
Yeah. Hard to argue against that, but yeah.
Well, I think you might find some interest in the writings of Michael Parenti, who discusses the use of the media in this way too, because a lot of this systemic stuff where like you can boil it down to, and I hate the conspiracy line of follow the money, but you can, in some cases, you can actually follow the money. You don't have to draw these inferences with very little evidence. And then you can also look at the way that things are being reported in the media. And while they may state the facts one way or another, often it's with a slight perspective that doesn't really address what's going on behind what's happening. Like, they'll report on Syria and they'll say this is a bad situation, or they'll even report on the specific people that have been harmed, but they never really ask the question why, right? Which I used to think was a fundamental tenet to journalism, but in a lot of cases you don't see that question being asked.
I just thought that, although, is that a thing that is that just because of modern? Because, like, I mean, let's face things have changed since, the last 40 years, since good old Reaganomics.
Yeah, that's right.
And if we're talking about the media used to be a lot more, we'll loosely use the word truthful, like
yeah, like
Reaganomics, because it was the profit motive wasn't quite as strong. But
yeah, I guess I know people would probably say, like, you can point at like the way that maybe the media portrayed, say, the Vietnam War, even like it wasn't always. It was, often it was portrayed in a more patriotic way, like the U.S. we're winning, or U.S. is like, oh, this many, they frame it in the terms of troop loss, but they never really talked about how the United States was actually losing the war, right? So at this point, Renee and I start talking about the media and how its role kind of impacts the way that the general public views various situations in foreign countries. This is all kind of wishy-washy stuff. Like, it's hard to really pin down sometimes. I'm not entirely happy with the way that I was discussing this. So I think I'm just going to skip it. And next week, I'm going to add in one of the questions, and I'm going to apply real philosophy, and I'm going to really get into it. Not sure which question I'm going to go with first, but I'm going to start going down this path, and hopefully we can get a little bit more Q&A, and maybe I can get some answers for people on what anarchism is. On to Red Reviews. Welcome to Red Reviews number 9 with Justin Clark. I guess, how are things going this week?
All right. I'm healing from poison ivy, which I got the first time in my life. So my left arm's a little fucked up. So if you see something gruesome, if I'm talking, I apologize. But it's getting better. It's the first time I ever had poison ivy in my life, and it just like completely ravaged my arm. It's pretty hardcore sometimes. Like the last time we talked is when it started. So I kind of had like a little rash on my arm the night that we recorded last, and that was like 2 weeks ago. I was like, man, this isn't going away. And it just kept getting worse. And then I had a friend who was like, oh no, that's poison ivy. You should do this. And so she recommended that I get this like wash thing. But yeah, I'm doing okay. Good. I'm living the American nightmare. Yeah, so it's good. And I'm really excited to do another book of history. So tonight we are going to be discussing Nixonland by Rick Perlstein. Cool. The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. And this book came out in 2008. This is the second volume of Rick Perlstein's 4-volume history of the rise of modern American conservatism.
Oh, neat.
So the first book was called Before the Storm, and it's all about the rise of Barry Goldwater, who ran for president. He was the senator from Arizona. He ran for president in 1964 and got completely wiped out by Lyndon Johnson.
Okay.
But he was sort of the progenitor of the, conservative movement. And then this book, as the sort of title and the picture implies, is all about Nixon.
Right.
President Richard Milhous Nixon, who was the 37th president of the United States.
Literally the worst.
Literally the worst. Truly one of the worst. One of the great ways to describe him is a serial collector of resentments, which is how Perlstein describes him in the book. So Nixon was president from 1969 until his resignation in 1974. Right. And he's the only president in U.S. history to ever resign. And if anybody knows anything about Nixon, usually that's what they know is Watergate. But the book actually covers 1965 to 1972. So it goes through, the latter half of Lyndon Johnson's presidency into the first term of Richard Nixon and his reelection in 1962. Richard Nixon was elected in 1968. He ran against Hubert Humphrey, who ran in a Democratic primary, who was the Democratic nominee, but had not won a single primary.
Okay.
The party bosses chose him to be the nominee, after the untimely death of Robert F. Kennedy, who was running for president in 1968 and was assassinated after winning the California primary. Most people think that had Kennedy lived, he would have been the nominee, and I think that's probably true. Right. But instead of giving consideration of the nominee to the person who was running against Kennedy in the primary, who had actually run in primaries, had won primaries, and had won delegates, was Eugene McCarthy.
Okay.
Senator Eugene McCarthy, who was the sort of the first anti-war candidate. And we'll get into that a little bit. But so just to give you kind of a big overview of the book, this is a huge book, as you can see. It's very thick, and it's a narrative history. So what do I mean when I call it a narrative history? So history is written in different ways, as we all know. But what narrative history is basically going through, and as the name implies, you sort of provide a narrative.
Right, you're telling a story almost.
Yeah, you're telling a story. Some history is written where it's very big picture and it's more analytical. And then some history is written more a sort of a day-by-day chronicling of events. And that's kind of what this book is. Although he does have some really great analysis in it, the vast majority of it is him just literally like a reporter laying out the facts for you over a period of 7 years. And he almost does it by day. Okay. So you get a sense of what is happening in the country at the time. So the book opens with the Watts riots, which happened in Los Angeles in 1965. In the mid to late 1960s, you had the rise of what they called race riots. Now, those had always been a component of American history, where things were called race riots. What they really were sort of in earlier eras, particularly the year 1919, was that it was actually white people rioting against a black person who might have been accused of a crime or done something untoward, whatnot. Right. But the ones in the 1960s were actually, people revolting. And the Watts riots were sort of the beginning of, when people think of the 1960s as being a very tumultuous period, and it was, there's this period of time between the Kennedy assassination in 1963, November 22nd, 1963, and the Watts riots, where you have this period of sort of relative calm and consensus. And now, mind you, again, take that with a bit of a grain of salt, because nothing is always as it seems. There's consensus for some. So what do I mean by that? So Rick Perlstein's framework, his sort of analysis of how he lays it out is in the early to mid 1960s, there was a sort of a New Deal inspired liberal consensus.
Okay.
And that liberal consensus, everybody sort of assumed would essentially rule American politics for generations, because it had a very steady voter base and it had a lot of public appeal. And so what does the liberal consensus mean? Basically what the liberal consensus is it's this idea of using the government to invest in infrastructure, to invest in public education, and to invest in social services as a means of making a more social democratic society. So that's really what the liberal consensus was everybody sort of agreed. Everybody, regardless of what political party you were in, everybody sort of agreed on a lot of these baseline things.
Okay.
And that also included civil rights. So, for example, when Richard Nixon ran for president the first time in 1960 as Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president against John F. Kennedy, if you actually look at the party platforms of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in 1960, the Republican Party was actually to the left of the Democratic Party on the issue of civil rights.
Wow.
And that was actually deliberately done by Nixon. Now, one of the things that's important to understand about Richard Nixon, who was born in Yorba Linda, California in 1913, one thing that's really important to understand about Richard Nixon is that he really didn't give a shit about domestic politics. So he was far more interested in foreign policy. And basically, he was, in many respects, the last New Deal liberal president on domestic issues.
Right.
As president, he sort of, advocated and almost passed a universal basic income.
Wow.
In 1970, which didn't happen because Democrats thought it wasn't generous enough. I mean, this is a completely different era, right?
Wow, no kidding.
It didn't pass because they were like, it's not enough. But it almost did.
That's amazing.
It would eventually sort of come back policy-wise later in what was dubbed by the economist Milton Friedman as the reverse income tax. Today, we call it the earned income tax credit.
Okay.
Which is kind of a version of universal basic income, but not really, because it's tied to taxation and employment. It's not just like a check that you get in the mail. And in fact, I apologize for the siren. And in fact, interestingly enough, the way that people received like child credits, or they were like the COVID relief bill that just passed had like child tax credits in it that were great. I mean, probably one of the most substantive pieces of progressive legislation to actually pass out of Congress in probably 40 years. But it's not saying much. Is that it's done through the IRS. So like you have to if you've had to have filed tax returns in order to receive these.
Right.
Whereas most people would advocate that direct cash transfers should go through the Social Security Administration. Sure. I apologize. That's a bit of a tangent.
No,
but anyway, so Richard Nixon was, the framework that he uses throughout the book to describe two types of people, the people who are like Nixon, who like Nixon and are Nixon, are what he calls the orthogonians. Okay. And what the orthogonians are a college fraternal group that Richard Nixon set up when he was in college, at Whittier College in California. Richard Nixon grew up very poor and working class, which most people don't actually realize about him. And he was extremely resentful of the sort of elites. And some of that sort of bubbled over into outright anti-Semitism.
Right.
There's on the White House tapes, there's all kinds of stuff, of him, saying, anti-Semitic stuff. I mean, he referred to his national security advisor and future Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, as my Jew. So it's like, that's the kind of guy.
Certainly not cool.
So some of the sort of rejection of elitism within Richard Nixon is some of it's anti-Semitic, and obviously some of it was also racist.
Yeah.
But there was also within Nixon, there was this real resentment of people who were, sort of people who were born into wealth, who were born into privilege, who had positions of power simply by virtue of being wealthy and well-connected. And people who went to the best schools, who had the best homes. And this would really come to a head when he would run against John F. Kennedy in 1960, right? Because John F. Kennedy is like the living embodiment of everything that Richard Nixon hates. And in the book, those are referred to as the Franklins. So at Whittier College, when he was going to college this would have been in the 1930s, there were two groups. There were the Franklins And the Franklins wouldn't let Nixon in because he didn't, he wasn't well enough off. He wasn't well connected. And he said, fuck them. I'll start my own group. And the thing about the thing that made why they were called orthogonians is that they were they were squares basically, because that's what, orthogonal, right?
Right.
That's why they're called the orthogonians. And then the Franklins, they wore tie and tails. So they were like full tuxedos when they would get together. It's very much like in Britain, how basically all recent prime ministers went to Eton. Okay. Like Boris Johnson went to Eton, and there are pictures of David Cameron, one of the previous prime ministers, and Boris Johnson wearing tie and tails, like a full tuxedo. And the thing about the orthogonians is that they wore just button-down shirts and no ties. Okay. So there's clearly this sort of cultural dynamic to Richard Nixon's sense of being working class. And the sort of cultural turn that we understand in American politics, where we define class not truly by income, but by sort of class signifiers. A lot of this shit in the modern era starts with Richard Nixon. And so he's very resentful, and that's part of what gets him motivated to be the kind of operator he is. So to give you an example of like the kind of hardships he had in his life, like, he had 2 brothers die when he was young. His mother, who's actually from my home state of Indiana, she was a Quaker, Hannah Milhouse, and his father, Frank Nixon, ran a sort of corner store when Nixon was young. So he had to get up at like 4:30 in the morning, go to the farmers, buy the oranges and this and that and the other. And so he grew up very poor and working class, and he resented people who had sort of wealth and privilege that was unearned. And that would sort of motivate his politics for his entire life.
It sounds awfully relatable.
Yeah. Right? Like,
except for the anti-Semitism and the racism,
yep.
like the resentment of the elites. I can be on board with that.
And that's something like when people talk about how Donald Trump was sort of a right-wing populist, and he was in a lot of ways. If you really want to get a sense of how right-wing populism became a real force of American politics, you really have to go back to Richard Nixon.
Right.
So I'll try to do a brief recap of his career up to his presidency. So born in 1913, goes to Whittier College, gets a scholarship to go to Harvard, but can't afford to move there. So then he eventually takes a scholarship with Duke University, where he does his law degree. Okay. Comes back to California. Does some odd jobs here and there. And then eventually he runs for Congress in the mid-1940s. And what made Nixon a political operator of real import that people cared about was his strident anti-communism. Right. So
now that's where we break ranks.
Yes, this is where we break ranks, right? So Richard Nixon was an extremely fervent anti-communist. He obviously supported Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s, the sort of McCarthyism of people being afraid that every other employee of the federal government was a communist. Right. And they were communist purges, His rise in American politics, his anti-communism. He was also a veteran of World War II. That's another thing too. Okay. He's a veteran of the Second World War. Then he gets out of the war and then runs for Congress. Wins, I think, in either 46 or 48. And he's actually recruited by basically the equivalent of the California Chamber of Commerce. Okay. And they come to him, they say, you're a young, fresh-faced guy, you're a veteran, and you have strong anti-communist credentials. We'll run you. And then he wins. And the thing that's very interesting, just as a quick aside, is people always assumed that Richard Nixon was much older than John F. Kennedy, just by appearances, but they were only 4 years apart. Okay, so they were they were in the same peer group, but Nixon was always presented as being the sort of older, more rugged. And I think a lot of it had to do with Richard Nixon's appearance. He had a very large nose. Right. He had jowls. He had a very, very, very thick beard. Sometimes during campaigning, he would literally have to stop at little corner stores and buy disposable razors during the middle of the day and shave to go to campaign events. So, yeah. So eventually he runs for the U.S. Senate. And when he runs for the U.S. Senate, he runs against a woman named Helen Gahagan Douglas. And the reason that that's important is because Helen Gahagan Douglas was the mistress of then Senate leader Lyndon Johnson, who would later become president.
Okay. So
this was sort of a known secret that everybody kind of knew that Helen Gahagan Douglas was his mistress. But nobody talked about it. So what did Nixon do to go after her? And one of the things that he did was he basically called her a communist. And implied that, he said, like, very coarse things. Like, these were not official campaign materials. Basically, like, she's as pink as her panties and like this kind of thing.
Now he sounds more like Donald Trump.
Now he sounds more like Donald Trump, right? So like that stuff, but basically he called her pinko and said how she's in bed with the communists and that.
Right.
He wins that Senate election. Right. So he sort of rides a wave that happens in the late 1940s, which for context is the sort of era, the 30s and into the mid to late 40s and 50s is when you see the beginning of the purging of communists and socialists from the American labor movement and from the American political system.
Right.
And so Nixon goes from being a congressman in the mid 1940s to by 1952 being Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice presidential nominee. And of course, Eisenhower wins the election of 1952 and Nixon serves as his vice president for 8 years.
Right. During
that time, Nixon sort of hones his chops in foreign policy, which is the main thing that animated his political being. Like I said earlier, he didn't really care about domestic politics. He cared way more about international affairs and foreign policy.
Right.
And when he was president, you could say he sort of belonged to what would be called the realist school of foreign policy. Very much influenced by the larger than life historical figure, war criminal, Henry Kissinger. So he's vice president for 8 years, runs for president in 1960. He loses the 1960 election very, very narrowly, extremely narrowly. Some people think, then I've argued that John F. Kennedy basically stole that election, that a lot of it had to do. Yeah. And a lot of it had to do with Illinois and Chicago. So, the Chicago mob were very much in tune with the labor movement up in Chicago. And so a lot of people speculate that part of the reason that Kennedy won, because he won by like 100,000 votes.
Oh, so
like
close.
Across the country. Yeah, it was extremely close. And it all came down to Illinois. So had Nixon won the state of Illinois, he would have won the presidency. But he didn't. And so he loses in 1960. And this is the era in which Nixon sort of goes into the political wilderness. And he then tries his hand at running for governor of California. So he runs for governor of California in 1962 against Edmund Pat Brown and loses that election.
Okay.
And this is where you get the infamous speech that he gives in front of the press corps the day after his election, or it was either the night of or the morning after, where he goes up there and he says, "I'm quitting politics for good. You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore."
Right.
And one of the things that's really important to understand about Richard Nixon, this is what makes him very similar to, later presidents, especially Donald Trump, is antagonism with the press. Mm-hmm. So Nixon hated the press, hated the way that he felt like he was treated by them, felt like he never got good coverage, despite the fact that basically his whole existence as a political animal was a media creation. I mean, he got decent coverage for most of his career. It was just, there was little stuff that he got that he didn't like, and so he would bitch about it. So Nixon goes into the political wilderness for a number of years. He founds a law firm, Nixon Mudge, which was out of New York City. He becomes basically a very wealthy and well-connected corporate lawyer. He works for PepsiCo. He works for a bunch of other people. And it's here that he starts to build this sort of architecture for another run. And so he basically campaigns in 1966 in the congressional midterms, and he goes to every fucking bumfuck place in the country for Republican candidates who would win back, I think, the House in 1966. And so it's him basically calling in, like, putting in little feelers like, I supported you in 66. What are you going to do for me? So it was a lot of that.
Like actual politics.
Like actual politics. Like
right.
Him going out doing that, right? And what is happening in the mid-1960s that has galvanized different sides of the political era in America? It's the Vietnam War.
Okay, yeah.
And so the Vietnam War is this sort of overarching problem and sort of political policy, a policy choice that has sort of dogged, at this point, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, John, at this point, 4 presidents.
Right. So,
yeah.
So the Vietnam War, that was a thing that was kind of, the U.S. was involved all that time?
So the U.S. was involved with Vietnam at least going back to the late 1940s. So,
oh, wow. So that's a long time.
The war in Vietnam was technically declared in 1964 after what was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which happened in August of 1964. Where it was claimed that Vietnam forces had shot on a U.S. submarine. It turns out that it was probably just an accident, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was very much like the WMDs in Iraq. It was a lie that they used to sort of galvanize the country in order to support the war. And so, but to give your audience a little bit of prior context with Vietnam, Vietnam was a colony of France. At the time, it was called Indochina. And after the end of the war, Vietnamese forces essentially began fighting a war for independence. And the French give it up. They're like, we can't fight this on anymore because the France had been ravaged by the Nazis in World War II. They really didn't have the resources in order to continue to fight for their colonies. Right. The British Empire at that time was also giving up its colonies and sort of losing its status as the world's hegemon. And in its place came the United States. And so starting in the early 1950s, the United States began sending what were called military advisors to Vietnam. And what they were was to prop up, because eventually what would happen with Vietnam, much like Korea, you'd have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was held by the communists, and South Vietnam was held by a military-backed dictator that was also supported by the United States. And so the United States declares war in Vietnam. Well, not really. What really actually happens is something called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is sort of its own era's AUMF that gives the president broad executive authority to fight the war. And so in 1966, 67, 68, we have been in full formal combat in Vietnam for almost 4 or 5 years. Okay. The war was very polarizing to Americans. Right. There was a very strong and active anti-war movement, of which many were socialists, communists, anarchists, and even sort of left of center liberals who supported, not bombing Vietnam.
Yeah, the caricature is the hippie movement, right? Like
the hippies, right? And some of that's true, but then also some of them were far more militant. We can get into that later when we get into sort of the 1968. So that just gives you some context. So Nixon would issue these statements about the Vietnam War where he would sort of trash Lyndon Johnson, but not. So he would play this very fine line where it was like, I disagree with the president's war policy, but here's why I do this. Like here's why I disagree with his war policy. But I don't disagree with the broader aims of the war. So this was because at the time, and this is the thing I think it's hard for, people of our era to understand, is that during the Vietnam era, the war was actually largely popular with the American public, well up into the early 1970s. Is really under Nixon's watch is really when the war starts to when the public tide really turns on the war. in a real substantive way. But you could also argue that happens with 1968 as well. So let's get up to 1968. This book, like a third of this book is about 1968.
Oh, wow.
1968 is one of the most important years in the history of America and in the history of American politics specifically. So in 1968, Richard Nixon runs for president again. He becomes the sort of comeback kid. No one ever thought in a million fucking years that Richard Nixon would run for president again.
Despite all the years of building.
Beside all the years between 1962 and 1968, building up his plan. He played this long game. He realized that in order for me to win, I have to placate enough different factions within the Republican Party at the time, which at the time, remember, the Republican Party of 1968 was very different than the Republican Party of today.
Right.
The Republican Party of 1968 still had, at that time, what would have been considered a liberal faction. So it would have had people in it like New York Mayor John Lindsay, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Michigan Governor George Romney, the father of Mitt Romney. So there were some liberal Republicans. And what that meant was they were sort of pro-business, but they were also pro-civil rights. Right. But there was also this growing Southern discontent. And so when people talk about the party switching at some point, this happens in the 1960s, and it largely happens as a result of civil rights. So the Civil Rights Act is passed in 1964. The Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. Additional civil rights acts are passed in 1968 and 67. And at the time, there was this sort of growing white resentment of civil rights. There was, and this is where you get into the idea of what Nixon would dub the silent majority. This is a phrase you would hear a lot during the era. The sort of unsung hero of the American, of American life, the hardworking suburban taxpayer who is almost exclusively white and who is almost exclusively middle class.
Yeah.
So Nixon uses these energies to sort of shore up a run. Now, what's going on? Who's the other big guy in the mid to late 1960s in the Republican Party who's the only one who could really challenge Richard Nixon? And that's Ronald Reagan.
Okay. He was that early?
Yes.
Okay.
So Ronald Reagan was actually successful in his run of the governorship of California in 1966. He beats Edmund Pat Brown in re-election. And he uses a lot of this sort of white resentment politics to win against Pat Brown, who had been, as the sort of press and as Reagan had described it, as sort of mealy-mouthed and wishy-washy on the issue of crime. Because you have to understand, in the 1960s, crime was actually really high. In the United States broadly, and especially in cities. And crime is nowhere near what it was back in the late 1960s.
Right.
It was pretty fucking awful, actually. And there are sort of demographical reasons for that. There's political reasons for that. And we can table that for another discussion. But there was crime. And so Reagan used the sort of politics of suburban white resentment to win the governorship of California. In 1968, there's this sort of backroom deal going on about him possibly being drafted to run as the Republican nominee for president.
Okay.
And there's an active campaign. And Richard Nixon knows that if he can't stop Reagan, he won't win. And so he does everything in his absolute power to stop Ronald Reagan from running for president.
Okay.
And he largely succeeds. And the reason that he succeeds is because Reagan knows that because his political shelf life is very short. Remember that Reagan had only been a national figure in American politics since his time, a time for choosing speech at the 1964 Republican National Convention.
Okay.
So he had only been in political life 3.5, 4 years, right?
Right.
And everybody sort of saw him as the future of conservatism, which in the long run
ended up being true.
Ended up being true. But Nixon was a much savvier political operative at that time than Reagan was, and shores up the election. Shores up the nomination, rather. So he had to stave off Reagan. Okay, well, he slayed Reagan. Okay, what's the other issue he has to deal with? And that's George Wallace.
Okay.
George Wallace was the governor of Alabama in the 1960s. He's the one that was most infamous for saying, segregation now, then, segregation now, segregation in the future, segregation forever. He was the sort of racist, bigoted former governor of Alabama who was running for president in 1968 on a third-party platform and would actually be fairly successful in that, almost to the detriment of Nixon. But Nixon's whole strategy, which has been dubbed by historians and political scientists as the Southern strategy, is this idea of using sort of white aggrievement cultural politics as a means of getting traditionally at that time Democratic working class, mostly Union voters to vote for Nixon.
Right.
And so that's what they did. And so everything that Nixon did was in service of this sort of white grievance identity politics.
Right. This was kind of the, if I might be mistaken, but I seem to recall this being like the rise of the dog whistle.
Absolutely. So one of the big dog whistles at the time was the issue of busing. So busing was the policy that in order to integrate schools after the 1956 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, where schools had to be desegregated with the phrase in the decision, with deliberate speed. And one of the ways that the federal government thought that they could do this and work with state governments was the issue of busing, where basically you would bus people to different schools in order to make them more integrated.
Right.
And white suburbans hated this because their whole argument was, I moved to the district, I pay my property taxes to go to send my kid to the school I want to, not to some school halfway across town that's shittier where all the black kids are. I don't want my kid with a bunch of black kids. I mean, that's basically the argument of a lot of these white suburbanites. Yeah. Busing is one of those ways that you could talk about racial as like sort of racialized language without being overtly racist. And Richard Nixon definitely played into this, although at the time, Nixon probably had the most sort of moderate or sort of vanilla version of it. The most fervent versions of this came from people like Reagan or George Wallace, Senator Robert Byrd, and also in the early 1970s, then Delaware Senator Joseph Biden. Who was against busing, which I think came up in the 2020 primary.
It might have.
With his now vice president. Which goes to show you how long Joe Biden has been in politics, is that he comes up in this book that took place 50 years ago.
Where everybody else is dead, or
everybody else is dead, right? Well, his political mentor was Senator Robert Byrd, who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and was the man who filibustered the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
That's not good.
But anyway, so Nixon placates Reagan, and he placates enough of Wallace's supporters to win the presidency in 1968. Now, briefly, I will mention, okay, well, that's the Republicans. What's going on with the Democrats? So when we want to talk about the modern era and how the Democratic Party seems to be completely adrift and doesn't really have much of an ideology, and they don't really have a working class base anymore, and they seem to really be just like the party for like identitarians and sort of liberal identitarians and bankers.
It's just the avoid the Republicans party.
It's the avoid the Republicans party. A lot of this starts in this era. So in 1968, Lyndon Johnson is president of the United States. He's a Democrat, and the Vietnam War has absolutely destroyed him and his presidency.
Okay.
And in the late March of 1968, he gives a speech on television where he says, I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. Which was a pretty bombshell thing. Lyndon Johnson had wanted to be president his entire life. It was the only thing he'd ever really wanted, and he loved being president until Vietnam essentially consumed him.
Right.
Because every year the Vietnam War got worse. There were more and more American casualties, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of Vietnamese people who were killed in the conflict. And every time, people like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara would come out on pressers and say like, well, the war's going great, but then in private they would realize, no guys, this is a fucking disaster. It's not going well at all. So there's within the Democratic Party itself, there's this rising anti-war movement that's really happening. And the first person to really, have the first shot off the bow is Senator Eugene McCarthy, who is this sort of quiet, bookish senator. I think from the Northeast or maybe the Midwest. I can't remember exactly what state he's from. But McCarthy decides to enter into the New Hampshire primary in the winter and spring of 1968.
Okay.
And while he does not win the New Hampshire primary, he gets an extremely close second. And at that point, that's when Lyndon Johnson said, I'm not going to run for a third term.
Okay.
And so at that point, Eugene McCarthy was the only declared candidate. Now, there were other candidates that were possibly waiting in the wings. So there was, at that time, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who would become the Democratic nominee in 1968. You had Senator Edmund Muskie, who would have a much more successful, and by successful, I mean just visible, campaign in 1972. And then, obviously, the big guy, the one everybody thought was going to run and would win, was Senator Robert Kennedy of New York.
Right.
John F. Kennedy's brother, former Attorney General. And he declares in the late spring of 1968 that he's running. And so he starts winning primaries. And eventually he wins the California primary. And back then, much like today, if you win the California primary, you're almost a shoo-in for the presidency. You have to kind of really fix everything everywhere else if you want to win the presidency without winning the California primary, which is what Joe Biden did in 2020. He did not win the California primary.
Right.
But Robert Kennedy, at a press conference after his win, is shot and killed, and dies almost immediately. The nation goes into mourning. He is killed basically almost a month to the day after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the noted civil rights activist who was killed on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. And you see that the Democratic Party is basically in shambles. They really don't know what to do. And so at that point, they say, well, let's draft Humphrey because we can't have McCarthy be the nominee.
Right.
Because at the time, Hubert Humphrey was sold as the electable candidate. And, it's just how history is. It rhymes.
Right. Yeah.
And so he is drafted as the Democratic nominee without winning a single primary, without competing in a single primary.
They just said, you're the guy.
You're the guy. And a lot of that had to do with Chicago mayor and Democratic political boss, and Democratic Party boss, Richard Daley.
Okay.
Who was very tied in with the unions. And so they supported Humphrey. And in 1968, Richard Nixon wins the presidency. And he wins, ironically enough, with a very narrow popular vote margin. He wins by about, I think it's somewhere around 300,000 votes. I mean, he wins by, or even less than that. A very, very small margin, very much like in 1960. Which goes to show you the sort of divisions that are happening at that time.
Right, yeah.
And he ran on a platform of sort of, ending the Vietnam War with honor. Because what's interesting in this whole election is that the Republican ran as the anti-war candidate, essentially. So Nixon sort of ran as the anti-war candidate because Humphrey, who was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, couldn't really talk too much shit about the Vietnam War policy or Lyndon Johnson while running. He would eventually do it in like September, October of 68, but that was too little too late.
Right.
One quick side note that's important is that one of the political operatives who was instrumental in the election of Richard Nixon was his media strategist, the guy who made him palatable for television. Because Richard Nixon knew after the defeats of 1960 and 1962 that I cannot win an election unless I'm good on television.
Right.
And so he hires a young guy who would become very popular. It's not true. Infamous. He would become extremely infamous later on. And that is Roger Ailes, who was the head of Fox News later on. But he was his television guru. There were a lot of people who worked on the Nixon campaign in 1968. He was one of them. Lee Atwater was another one who would go on and work on George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan's campaigns. Roger Stone, who was in the news a lot with Trump. And Karl Rove, who was George W. Bush's advisor and campaign manager and sort of guru.
Yeah, these are all names that I recognize.
They're all scumbags. But yes, they all sort of start cutting their political chops during the Nixon campaign.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to mention, because obviously we're a podcast devoted to leftism and radical politics, is that while all this is going on, there is an extremely radical current of American politics. So you have at this time the emergence of a more militant form of the Black freedom struggle. So the emergence of the Black Panther Party, and then the emergence of certain Maoist sects.
Okay.
Which would eventually sort of boil over and become, one of them at least would become what was known as the Weather Underground, which was this radical political group that who did terrorist acts in the 1970s.
Okay.
Most people who know about the Weather Underground know about it because of one of the leaders within the Weather Underground was a friend and advisor to Barack Obama when he was a young organizer. And so that was a big story, was that Obama was tied to the Weather Underground. But anyway, so you have that. You have 1968 in a nutshell. The Democratic National Convention that happens in Chicago in 1968 led to some of the most violent police altercations in American history, where protesters outside of the convention in Chicago were beaten and clubbed, some to death. Some had horrible injuries.
Right.
And it led to full-blown chaos in the summer of 1968. And much like today, the sort of American left was largely ignored, and it didn't have the kind of power that it had once had in sort of maybe the 1930s or 40s. And when I say the left, I don't mean liberals. I mean actual communists or socialists. And so, you have that. You have Ronald Reagan was the governor who fired Angela Davis from the UCLA. Okay. Angela Davis, the famed author, intellectual, and political dissident here in the United States, who was accused.
Yeah, leftist hero.
Yeah, she was a member. She was a member of the Communist Party. She was for a time loosely affiliated with the Black Panthers, but she actually left the Black Panthers because she had issues with their take on gender, and became more affiliated with just sort of the Communist Party. She would be fired from her teaching position at UCLA. By Ronald Reagan, and because Ronald Reagan is the head of the University of California system. The governor serves as the head of that system, or at least it did in 1960. What would have been 1969, 70, somewhere around there.
Definitely wouldn't be beneficial to be a communist during that time when Ronald Reagan
Exactly, right. When Ronald Reagan is governor, right. One of the things that people always mention about Ronald Reagan, where people try to sort of retcon his political history and sort of paint him as being more liberal than he actually was, where they say, well, he signed an assault weapons ban when he was governor of California. Well, there's a very deliberate reason for that, which is because of the Panthers.
Yeah.
The Black Panthers believed in armed militant struggle, and they actually carried assault rifles into the California State House in Sacramento. And of course, suburban white people were fucking horrified. And that's why they passed a sort of weapons ban in California. So there's all this radical energy going on at the time. You have the anti-war movement. You have the sort of, like I said, the militant Black freedom struggle. You also have the emergence of the women's rights movement, and women's autonomy. And then obviously the beginnings, the sort of stirrings of the LGBTQ rights movement. So all these are going on at the same time, and they all become enemies of Richard Nixon, who takes office as president in January 20th, 1969. And for the next 4 years, he sort of does domestic policy placating, foreign policy maneuvers, and then tries to use every arm of the federal government to go after dissent. So one of the things that was unique about Richard Nixon's foreign policy was that it was largely done out of the Oval Office. So his Secretary of State, I think, and his Secretary of Defense, these high-ranking cabinet officials who should have been really in some of these more high up policy meetings or decisions about the Vietnam War or about relations with the Soviet Union, they were largely left out of the loop. And most of the foreign policy was done by Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who had come onto the campaign in 1968. Mm-hmm. The other quick thing that I didn't mention that is a really important part, but I won't go into it too much, is that Nixon likely committed treason while running for president in 1968, wherein the Johnson White House was actively working on peace talks with the North Vietnamese government in order to come up with some kind of settlement to end the war. Right. And Nixon had people who worked essentially as agents on behalf of his campaign work to throw what he literally wrote in his notes, throw a monkey wrench into it, and try to scuttle the talks, which is in direct violation of what's called the Logan Act, where private citizens cannot make foreign policy decisions of the federal government. Right. So Nixon likely committed treason, which is what I find particularly fascinating is that, and this is something Lawrence O'Donnell makes a point he makes in his book on Nixon in 1968, is that when Nixon was pardoned by Gerald Ford for Watergate, the pardon that Ford offered him was for any crimes or misdemeanors made between January 20th, 1969 and August 8th, 1974.
So pre that.
So anything pre that was fair game. And so O'Donnell makes the point of saying that Nixon lived the rest of his life knowing that he could have been charged with treason.
Right.
So, but yeah, so like he almost likely committed treason. I mean, he did. I mean, there's historical evidence to go into this. Recent Nixon biographer John A. Farrell has talked about this. He wrote a really great excerpt about it in the New York Times when the book came out, I think 4 or 5 years ago. But yeah, so on top of being a liar and duplicitous shithead, Nixon was also a traitor. So you have all that.
Not terribly surprising that he added that on top of all the other shit.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, compared to what he did in 1968, Watergate looks like a tea party.
Right.
I mean, he did far worse shit before becoming president than he did when he was. So the Vietnam War raged for another 6 years. It would formally end in 1973, but the conflict would continue at least until 1975, and that's when the last of American troops were kicked out of Vietnam. And then the country was unified under a communist government, which still is in place today. But his Vietnam policies were not working, but he really wanted to make them work, and he had this policy that he called Vietnamization, where he argued for moving increasingly more of the military burden onto the South Vietnamese army.
Okay.
Instead of having U.S. troops do it. But troop levels continued to rise, deaths continued to rise, and the public began to really turn on and sour on the Vietnam War, and particularly Nixon's handling of it. And his polls start to dip and everything like that. And so in 1972, he decides to do a couple of things that boost his opportunities in the 1972 election. The first is that he says he has his domestic policy advisors essentially craft a series of economic policies that would help the country sort of get out of a mild recession, which was happening in sort of 71, 72. The other thing that he did on the foreign policy front was his historic trip to China, which happens in 1972, which is where you get the adage from Spock in Star Trek where he says only Nixon could go to China.
Right.
So Nixon visits the People's Republic of China in 1972. It's the first time a sitting U.S. president had visited the communist-led government there. He does meet with Chairman Mao and starts the beginnings of what would be a deep a diplomatic relationship between the United States and the PRC that exists to this day. And that became a large triumph for him. People were surprised, but they took him seriously because of his anti-communism. Mm-hmm. So let's get into, and I know this book is so big and there's so much in it, but I will finish with 1972.
Okay.
1972, Richard Nixon runs for re-election. And he's a at that time, he was popular, but not as popular as he could be. But he's on fast track to winning re-election. Right. And largely because the Democratic Party is in complete and utter shambles. So post 1968, there's what was called a sort of reform commission, which is very similar to what they did in 2016 with Bernie Sanders. Right. After that primary, wherein the primaries, and particularly the voting public, would have far more democratic input on who would be the party's nominee for president. And the person who leads this commission is none other than Senator George McGovern, Democrat from, I think maybe Nebraska, one of the Plains states. Okay. And he becomes a sort of leading figure in Democratic Party politics. And so there's a lot of speculation about who's going to be the nominee in 1972. Is it going to be George McGovern? Is it going to be Edmund Muskie, who I talked about being very popular? Or Senator Edward Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, the youngest of the Kennedy brothers, senator from Massachusetts. Nixon was trying to rig it so that it would be Jesse Jackson, so that he could run against Jesse Jackson, sort of use that white resentment even more. Yeah. And so eventually what happens is the primaries continue on. Largely the Vietnam War is a big part of them. And George McGovern wins the Democratic primary. And this is kind of a watershed moment in American politics, because this is, to me, the nomination of George McGovern is really the beginning of the shift of the Democratic Party away from being a sort of working class, culturally and politically party to being the party of sort of more well-educated people and minorities, because those are the people who supported McGovern and helped him get the nomination. And the party basically changed under his influence. Nixon is far more successful in 1972 with placating George Wallace. I mean, that and an assassin's bullet, but there was an assassination attempt on George Wallace when he was trying to run for president again in 1972 that would leave him, I think, paralyzed from the waist down and put him out of action. And the world is better off for it. And the world is better off for it. Although I will say this about George Wallace. Doesn't make him a good person. But later in his life, he recounted and denounced his previous career and laid out that he was wrong, and then he apologized for it. Which is something people don't remember about George Wallace. Right. I mean, he was still a scumbag, but he sort of realized later in life that he was a scumbag. Maybe taking a bullet in the spine will do that to you. Maybe, yeah. But he sort of realized, hey, I was wrong or whatever. Wow. But anyway, Nixon was able to sort of placate that vote because he was afraid a lot of them would go to the Democrats. Well, they didn't. So how does Richard Nixon win both of these elections? And especially 1972, because he wins re-election in 1972 in one of the largest, if not the largest, electoral college landslide in American history. He wins every state but one. Wow. I think the only one he didn't win was Massachusetts, which is the only one that McGovern got. It wasn't even his home state. So Richard Nixon won by, I think, 60-something% of the vote in 1972. Jeez. Yeah. Which is why it's always so weird when you hear that what was happening in 1972 there was a group who broke into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate Hotel and tried to do what was described by the press by Nixon's press secretary Ron Ziegler as a third-rate burglary. And this event, this little minor event, which happened around the same time as some Vietnam peace talks, and when the Washington Post first printed about it, and same with the New York Times, it was just like a little column about these guys breaking in. Right. That would eventually become the scandal of Watergate and would eventually lend to the end of Richard Nixon's political career. And in fact, one of the captions in this book, when he won election in 1972, the Democrats continued to hold both houses of Congress. And so Perlstein writes, Nixon won the 1972 presidential election in a historic landslide. He responded like a defeated man. His congressional coattails were short. That's how they'll piss on the whole thing, he said of his nemesis to the press. 20 months after his landslide victory, he would no longer be the leader of anything. And that would basically be his resignation as president on August 9th, 1974. So what's the big picture on this? The big picture is that Richard Nixon was an astute student of politics who truly understood and was able to really harness the power of white suburban resentment.
Yeah.
Which is something that Donald Trump was also very good at.
Yeah.
And I think for us, what the big takeaway is that the sort of right populism of today, this sort of cultural shift where what's deemed working class is sort of set by cultural signifiers rather than economic indicators. A lot of that ties back to Nixon and the Southern strategy in the late 1960s.
Yeah, it's working class as an identity, not as a state of actual being. Like,
yes. This is how you'll get people who are, petty bourgeois who maybe own like a construction company that's worth $3 or $4 million.
Yeah, that consider themselves blue collar.
And they consider themselves blue collar working class when they're totally not. And that was sort of the contingency. That was the constituency of the Nixon. But he also got a lot of union support. The unions some unions definitely backed Nixon in 1972 because they sort of saw the Democrats as being waffly, and they supported the war. So most of the unions supported the war, including the AFL-CIO. So, yeah. So Nixonland's a great book. It's incredible narrative history. I've truly only in an hour just scratched the surface of all that he packs a lot in this book. He primarily uses manuscripts. So he uses actual written letters and policy documents and stuff from the Nixon Presidential Library. But he also uses a lot of newspapers and magazines to get a sense of the cultural zeitgeist. What are people, so in the book, he also talks about what people were reading. Which turns out to be a lot of apocalyptic shit in the 1960s and 70s, which is very similar to today. Or, he talks a little bit, obviously he talks about the fashion. He talks about what's going on television. He talks about the sort of generational divide. He talks about music and art and all that stuff. Because obviously we're talking about the late 1960s. So it's like Woodstock and, and San Francisco and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot
going on.
There's an incredible amount going on. What I think I want people to take away from this is that the book is a lot about how, and I think the last sentence of the book is great because I think it lays out perfectly what the sort of thesis of the book. He says, do Americans not hate each other enough to fantasize about killing one another in cold blood over political and cultural disagreements? It would be hard to argue they do not. How did Nixonland end? It has not ended yet. And so a lot of the political and cultural divisions that happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s that are recounted in this book are still very much in vogue today and are, I think, only heightened with the passage
they're just
of time.
amped up, right?
I think so. So, this is an incredible book. Maybe in the future, we will do reviews of the last two books in the series. The next book in the series is called The Invisible Bridge, and it covers the end of the Nixon presidency, Watergate, his resignation, Gerald Ford's time in office and the election of Jimmy Carter, and the very contentious 1976 Republican primary where Ronald Reagan ran against Gerald Ford. And then the last book, which is called Reaganland, which is all about the Carter presidency and then the election of Reagan. So, so the next two books are more about Reagan than they are about anything else.
Right.
Reagan's but a minor figure in this book, but becomes a major player in the next two.
Wow.
So yeah, an incredible book. I think Rick Perlstein's excellent. As as a trained historian myself, I'm very impressed by his really good use of narrative flair, and really, you really feel like you're there, like you're kind of reading it as it's happening.
Wow.
But he also has a lot of good analysis too about sort of the divisions and the sort of cultural politics and all that. So I highly recommend the book. I think people should check it out. It's big, but it's not hard to read. It's very easy to read, and it's very fun. He's really good at turning a phrase.
Cool.
And I highly recommend it.
Awesome. This makes me want to read it, but obviously I don't have the time for that.
Yeah. And I know, like, unfortunately, because of just how much of material I wanted to try to cover, I realized this was a little bit less back and forth. So I apologize.
Oh, no, that's fine. It was really informative. And I hope listeners and viewers find this entertaining, because I don't know, I'm enjoying this.
Thank you. Yeah, I love political history. I always have. So even though I'm not really cued into like party politics much anymore, I love reading about the history of the parties and like how they changed, where they made mistakes. Because quite frankly, I think that the Democrats have never really recovered from 1968. I think that ghost hangs over them. And then the ghost of Reagan does too. And they both do a number on how the party basically acts today.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And the sort of rightward turn of American politics.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. So, do we know what we're covering next time?
Next time we are covering, let's see real quick. Next time we will be covering Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti.
Nice. So
we will be doing one of my favorite books. The book that probably more, outside of reading Marx and Lenin, made me a Marxist-Leninist. So I love Black Shirts and Reds.
Cool.
And I look forward to, going back and talking about Parenti again on the podcast.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'm going to have to ask you where to find your stuff, but first I want to say thank you to our single Twitch viewer.
Yeah, we got a Twitch viewer. All right.
Somebody sat with us this entire time. So
that's awesome. I thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope that you weren't bored to tears by sort of intra-party debates in the 1960s.
All right. So where can people find more from you?
They can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. And then my Instagram is justinclarkph for a public historian. And in terms of new stuff I've got coming out, I have a new essay probably coming out sometime in September or October in the Truth Seeker magazine on the friendship of Robert Ingersoll and Eugene Victor Debs, the American socialist. So I'm working on that. It's been really fun putting that one together, and I look forward to getting it out. And yeah, so that's where you can find me. And then also, I'm a candidate member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And if you're interested in learning more about the Party for Socialism and Liberation, I highly recommend you check them out. They're great. And you can find them, I think, at pslweb.org.
That sounds right to me. I looked up their website after the last time. So. Right on. Well, thanks again. And I guess, talk to you in a couple weeks.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for sticking with us this far. I hope you enjoyed that review of Nixonland. If you like the reviews with Justin Clark, then make sure to check out previous episodes. I've got some of the reviews uploaded on YouTube as standalone videos. And next up is the Anarchist Reading Corner, where I read The Anarchist Turn. Yeah, I hope you enjoy it. All right, welcome to the next segment of Anarchist Reading Corner. Last I stopped at the end of this segment, this section here, where it says we want to avoid the self-imposed ghetto of autonomy. And we're going on to Black and Red Reciprocal Antidotes. In the previous section, I have tried to illustrate why Marxism and anarchism converge in the idea that freedom can only be a freedom of equals. What I want to do now is argue that a marriage between Marxism and anarchism is particularly beneficial in that they can find each other in a reciprocal antidote to their possible degenerations. First, anarchism finds in Marxism a good antidote to prevent a possible individualist twist in its absolutization of freedom. It is a fact that the radical praise of freedom that characterizes anarchism in its historical manifestations has been interpreted in both directions, the individualist and the social. According to the former, freedom is mainly the freedom of the individual, whereas according to the latter, which we have analyzed here under the name of Bakunin, freedom can only be attained collectively. The point is not only that, historically speaking, an individualist interpretation of anarchism has proved to be possible. Much more radically, individualism is a temptation that is always present within anarchism. We began this chapter with Stirner's advocacy of radical egoism, but many other examples can be added. We just have to think of anarcho-capitalism, which, particularly in the United States, combines the emphasis on freedom with the advocacy of an unrestricted development of capitalism. You could simply dismiss these positions as fallacious, Robinsonades, but the point remains that they are still very influential because they align with the prevailing individualist assumptions that underpin our societies. In light of the difficulties encountered in promoting the realization of freedom of equals on a large scale, anarchists may easily fall into the individualist temptation and limit their fight to the realization of spaces of autonomy in small, self-enclosed communities. This, I believe, is the risk that many autonomous movements have in the past fallen into, without realizing that the creation of autonomous communities may well turn into a form of individualism on a large scale. This creation of self-enclosed spaces is usually justified on the basis of the argument that they prefigure what a free society might look like, but they risk prefiguring nothing but what the society actually is. Go away. But what the society actually is. Individuals, singular or collective, pursuing their own interests in isolation. For this possible degeneration, Marxism contains a powerful antidote. Marx's critique of the Robinsonades can be extended to all levels to concretely support the idea that either we are all free or are all equally slaves. The reason why Marxism is better equipped than traditional Marxism to make this point, as we have seen, Bakunin equally supported the idea of freedom as freedom of equals, is that it is focused more systemically on the economic conditions for the realization of such a freedom. Few intellectuals have embarked on such an extensive analysis of the concrete economic conditions for the realization of freedom as Marx did. As such, his critique of utopian socialism, and more generally the idea that to describe an ideal state of things will automatically engender change simply because of its intrinsic intellectual value, is a powerful reminder of the dangers of any abstract metaphysics of freedom by envisaging utopian communities on the sole basis of the fanatical belief in the miraculous effects of their theory. People risk ending up in a reactionary position, unable to keep pace with the current state of the world. I cannot enter here into a detailed reading of Marx's analysis of capitalism and modernity. There are parts of it that are outdated, in particular as a result of the novelties brought about by post-Fordism and flexible capitalism. Let me simply point out here that what I believe are the most timely parts of Marx's work. In the first place, there is the analysis of capitalism's capacity to overcome all sorts of political barriers. We live in an epoch where there is so much talk about globalization and the crisis of the nation-states in relation to the capacity of the economy to go beyond national boundaries. But this is something that nobody predicted more acutely and more precisely than Marx. In many places in his work, he talks about capitalism's capacity to go beyond national boundaries. Consider, for instance, the following passage from the Manifesto of the Communist Party, in which he wrote with Engels. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. In the place of old wants satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature. In a time when there is so much talk about the novelty of globalization, which, so many argue, calls for the new form of cosmopolitanism, it is worth returning to this passage. Here, Marx and Engels clearly point to the cosmopolitan character of capitalistic production and consumption, to the fact that with the heavy artillery of the cheap prices of its commodities, capitalism will batter down all Chinese walls, so that in place of the old local and national self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, at both the material and cognitive level. We cannot but be struck by the timeliness of these remarks. It has become something like a commonplace to say that we live in a globalizing world, where material and cultural boundaries are being challenged from different sides. Only the historical amnesia of a generation of scholars who, after 1989, have too quickly become militantly ex-Marxist, can explain how it is possible to talk so much about globalization without mentioning the author who most emphatically and accurately predicted it more than a century ago. Marx's economic analysis gave further underpinning to the concept of freedom of equals that we have highlighted above with his path-breaking analysis of commodity fetishism. If Bakunin is right in saying that freedom has to be a freedom of equals because from the beginning we are subjected to the tyranny of society, which imposes its material and representational significations on our minds and bodies, then it is precisely from the possible commodification of such significations that we have to start. Perhaps only the visionary and situationist Guy Debord has sufficiently underlined this point, with his idea of a society of spectacle, whereas Marx begins Capital by arguing that the world has become an immense collection of commodities. Debord rephrases this claiming by saying that in societies dominated by modern conditions of production, life is presented as an immense accumulation of spectacles. We live in a society of spectacle that rests on the commodification of the social imagery within which all are socialized. The global social imaginary we live in is imbued with a commodity fetishism to the point that even our bodies are constituted by it. However, it is not only anarchism that needs Marxism. If a freedom of equals is to be realized, anarchism plays an equally crucial role because it contains the antidote for a possibly statist and authoritarian degeneration of Marxism. It is a fact that Marx remained vague about the path to realize freedom. If it is clear that, according to him, the freedom of equals can only be obtained through a radical revolution that subverts the capitalist system of production, the ways to bring about such a revolution remain open to dispute, and change considerably through his works, whereas Marx is ambiguous on this point, and in some places does not hesitate to speak of a dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary transition period from a capitalist to a communist society. Bakunin is crystal clear. If freedom is the end, freedom also must be the means to realize that end. As Bakunin and Malatesta put it, to endanger freedom with the pretext of protecting it, be it through the dictatorship of the proletariat or an avant-garde party that should authoritatively lead the masses to the revolution, is a dangerous nonsense which cannot but ultimately destroy freedom itself. Incidentally, this is a clarity that was to lead to Bakunin's expulsion from the International Working Men's Association dominated by Marx and the German Social Democrats. If Marx was ambiguous in his writings, he was much less so in calling for Bakunin's ban on the basis of his unorthodox view. However, the experience of the Soviet Union showed that Bakunin was right when he criticized the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, along with any other authoritarian attempt to realize the freedom of equals. There is not just one absolute truth about the road to revolution, and thus no avant-garde party, however well-versed in theory it might be, can ever explain to the masses how they should liberate themselves. If you restrict freedom, albeit temporarily, with a pretext of preparing its realization, you cannot but end up destroying it. As a consequence, any worker state, be it a dictatorship of the proletariat or not, cannot but reproduce the same logic of every state, where a minority of bureaucrats rule over the majority of people, that is, authoritarianism. To conclude this point, anarchism not only provides the antidote to the statist degeneration of Marxism, it can more generally prevent the authoritarian trap into which many attempt to realize the freedom of equals can fall. This is an antidote that communists of all sorts need, since, as Proudhon pointed out very clearly, communism can be well realized through the principle of authority itself. Anarchism, on the contrary, cannot. To put it bluntly, Marxists have proved to be able to become Stalinists, whereas a Stalinist anarchist is a contradiction in terms. And I think since that section is done, and there's only a couple minutes left in my time here, I think that I'll stop there. I hope that you're enjoying this Anarchist Reading Corner, and we will continue it next episode. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work, so that I don't have to work as many gig jobs. If you want to contribute, then you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice, or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes or check out my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcorey. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, and From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics. My Twitter is @skepticallefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/cjbrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. Or you can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope that you have a good one.